Lovely. Well, thank you very much indeed, everybody, for coming, and for also that very, very nice introduction. Athelhampton probably needs very little introduction. Many of you will probably know it was built at the end of the Wars of the Roses, when the Tudors came to power, came to the throne, Henry VII, and the Tudor Rose still adorns the wonderful great doors that give access to the great hall. And then there's a modern extension, which you can see there on the left-hand side, that was built in about 1560. Now, what I love about Athelhampton is that it, unlike many buildings from that era, it is essentially still a Tudor building. And so I think as we look forward to the rest of the 21st century and beyond, where clearly energy is such an enormous challenge, and it was an enormous challenge, we all knew that, at the start of this year because of climate change. We know it even more now because of energy security. So the plan was to say, let's take Athelhampton to zero carbon for its energy emissions. But in doing that, what are the challenges we face? Perhaps if we can have the next slide there. So the plan to get there in 2 years, zero carbon emissions from the energy. But what are the challenges here? Well, a grade 1 listed house and gardens, ongoing visitors, give or take 20,000 visitors a year. We hope there'll be more. And then events, whether it's weddings, the ballet festival, the food festival, and so on. And of course, the need to make it all financially sustainable as well. So those were the challenges in trying to get there. But we've got to get there. And here is one of the great big gas tankers, which until about a year or so ago was delivering masses of gas to Athelhampton, sometimes, I think, every month or so, filling up to enormous great gas tanks, which powered all of the heating, powered all of the cooking, and then on top of that, we even had some a kind of rather cronky-looking diesel backup generator and a bit of oil for cooking as well. So that was a pretty big burden of fossil fuels. And you can see here, for those who are interested in the kind of more technical aspects of this, up at the top there is the LPG that you just saw arriving in that great big tanker. And that we reckon amounted to something like 66 tons of carbon emissions per year. And then the cooking may not sound very much, but when you've got a big commercial kitchen, helping all of those visitors to meals every year, nearly another 10 tons of carbon from that. And then electricity for everything from lighting to the pumps in the gardens, whatever, another 18 tons. And then that rather cronky old diesel generator, another 1.5. And another picture, please, there. Those are the gas tanks. And how nice it was to be able to, peel the soil back on those and then have them lifted up and taken away. Oh, and you remember that day, I think, when they came and lifted them out. I think they were quite reluctant to lift them out, actually. I thought, what are you doing getting rid of this? But that was what we did. And in fact, we rather jumped the gun as we got rid of them before we really got all of the renewables in. Anyway, so how do you do it? And really a 3-point plan here: solar power, heat pumps, and then battery storage as well, which of course allows you to make use of the solar electricity generated in the night time when the sun isn't actually shining. So now, how much solar power? Well, it's 130 kilowatts of peak power. And I'll show you in a moment something about what that means. And what we've done is we've put in 4 great big banks of solar power in the paddock, and another long, thin bank in the yard. But the nice thing about all of that, obviously, of course, we had to have permission for it, but it wasn't just a matter of permission. We wanted to do it in a way so that the visitors, people using the house, wouldn't sort of think, oh my goodness, they've kind of covered it in solar panels. And so we got what I call here concealed near enough. You might, if you're in the right spot, just catch a little kind of view through the trees. But essentially speaking, you just basically don't know that it's there. Now, if you come to Athelhampton and say, oh, but we've got a sign of it, well, yes, you can just catch it, but only almost if you're looking for it. And I think that's the way it should be. So let's have a look now. How much you get? So obviously, it's obvious you get a lot more in summertime. And the total annual output is about 140 megawatt hours, which put in that means 140,000 kilowatt hours. And a kilowatt hour is what we also call a unit of electricity, which, depending on who your supplier is, at the moment costs you maybe about 18, 20 pence per unit. Sadly, that's going to be going up as we go through this year. So this is perhaps to buy that electricity at the prices that were prevailing at the start of this year. That would be about £30,000 worth of electricity, and would cost a lot more by the end of the year. So that gives you an idea of the scale of what we're doing here. But believe it or not, that's not actually enough to make up for taking away all that gas. And so in order to, as it were, magnify the effect of it, what we do is we use heat pumps. Now, this is a picture of one of the 2 heat pump installations. We had a gentleman from the television actually over yesterday, and he looked at one of these installations and he said, it's like the Sistine Chapel. I don't think I'd go quite as far as that, but I kind of know what he meant. I think all that copper pipework is really rather beautiful. And some of you are probably very familiar with heat pumps, some of you perhaps a little bit less familiar. But the magic of a heat pump is that it takes the warmth either from the ground or from the air, and it uses it to heat the house. And so it's almost like, you could say it's like a free lunch. Perhaps another way of putting it is to say it's another form of solar power, because it's taking the warmth that has got into the ground as a result of the sun warming up the ground, or it takes the warmth that's got into the air as a result of the sun heating up the air. Now, there's one slight problem with the heat pumps, is that in order to do this, you've got to pump water through the system. So, for example, if you're getting that warmth out of the ground, you've got to pump colder water into the ground, and then it comes back out again warmer. And you need electricity to do that. So what we do is we take some of that electricity that we got from the solar panels, and we use it to do that pumping. And what's really nice is that for every unit of electricity that you use to do that pumping, you get up to 4 equivalent units of heat coming out. So we're taking all that solar energy and we're kind of magnifying up the benefit of it, if that makes sense. Let's move on, please. Now, in order to make all this happen, we had to upgrade the power supply. And again, and from a single phase to a 3-phase, which I suppose in layman's terms means we just had to make the power supply more powerful. And in order to do that, we needed to put in lots and lots of extra cables. And of course, you can't just do that in a wonderful Grade 1 listed garden that was all laid out by Inigo Thomas in response to the request of Alfred Carte de la Fontaine in the 1890s. So what do you do when you use this really quite extraordinary machine? If anybody in my younger days, I didn't really get like that, I watched the Thunderbirds program and they had that mole that went underground. And this was a bit like that. It kind of dug tunnels under the ground and under the river so we could get the cables in without disturbing things. Very, very clever, I must say. So let's just move on now. And then I did mention that, of course, the sun doesn't shine at night. And so we've got a battery array, courtesy of that gentleman over in California, Mr. Elon Musk. And so the battery array allows us to take that solar energy and then reuse it in the night, which is actually when you tend to need it most, because it's a cold out there, of course, so you want it to operate those heat pumps. And if we could have the next slide, please. I mean, don't worry about the detail of this too much. Suffice to say that what you're looking at here is that when you go below the line there, you've got the batteries charging up, and then when you go above the line, you've got the batteries discharging. So it's just a way of balancing between the different times of day. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. So if I look at where we are going to be in 2022, and we're nearly there, we haven't quite wired up the last bits of this, but we're about, I would say, 3/4 of the way there now, and hopefully we'll be finished, just sort of one contract left to sign up and finalise. So what we've got here, we've got something like 140, 150,000 kilowatt hours of electricity. And as you can see, we're then using it for all of those functions that we were doing before. The heating, instead of the gas, we're now using the heat pumps and the solar energy to do that. The cooking, we've scaled back the amount of energy that we need for that. And we've got lovely efficient electric ovens, so that codes with that. And then the third heading there, looking at the lighting and the pumps and so on, again, by putting in LED lights, that uses much, much less power. And although you may say, yeah, but lighting doesn't really matter very much, well, when you've got a house on the scale of Athelhampton, it really does. And so our solar energy is, and obviously able to use that at night, is helping us with the lighting. And then finally, for the backup generator, well, we've been able to get rid of that, of course, completely, because the batteries provide us with the backup, subject to one or two final tweaks that we're working on. So there we are, and if we have a glance at the next slide, we're virtually on the target for consuming no more electricity than the amount of electricity that we're producing. We might go just 1 or 2 kilowatts more consumption, but we're near enough there. And then if we look at the financial side of all of this, so we were at the old prices, looking at a gas and electricity bill of around about £38,000 a year. We estimate that would have been going up to probably around about £55,000 with the prices going up this year. And under the new system, we'll be pretty well down to 0. But then obviously, we've got a very, very big capital cost in there to have achieved that. We were helped a little bit by Low Carbon Dorset, which, very, very grateful for that, very generous and hopefully very well targeted to actually help us to put this in. But I'd emphasise, generous as it was only a very small proportion of that overall cost. Then the result, as you can see, is that at the old electricity prices, we'd have taken about 20 years to pay back the capital cost. At the new electricity prices, we're down to around 12 or 13 years to pay it back. So if we can have the next slide, please. I'm sorry? That'll do us fine. Yeah, that's great. So there we are. I hope that's given you a bit of an overview. As I would say, I'd summarise by saying we're taking a Grade 1 listed house and garden that's been there in essence for well over 500 years and really trying to set it up sustainably for, if not the next 500 years, then certainly perhaps the next 100 years or more, and really eliminate the carbon emissions from the house, from the energy, and move forward with the renewable energy, but in a way that hopefully is not obvious to anyone. Although, I think we're finding some people are actually rather interested in it and will actually want to kind of peer around the corners at some of those copper pipes, for example, just to see what's going on. So I think, if I may, I'll probably draw to a close to the formal session, and then very much, of course, invite questions if people have them.
Thank you very much. If we may, could we perhaps start with questions on the body of your speech, and then perhaps a question on the history and other issues in Athelhampton which we could follow on from. If I could start off on technical issues, have you done anything about insulation of the loft, and also the windows, of course, and doors where there's a huge amount of heat on?
Well, I think it's an outstanding question, and I think it's probably fair to say that on many houses, that is one of the cheapest and quickest ways of getting a major payback in terms of reducing energy costs and carbon emissions. As I'm sure you know, and many people here will know, with older houses, and especially, of course, with listed and historic buildings, it becomes radically more difficult. I think I mentioned at the very beginning that we've got those wonderful oak doors put in when Henry VII was on the throne. And I think that if we start putting even just, that kind of insulating tape around it, probably not going to be popular with English heritage or the visitors. And the same with some of the stained glass windows with the amazing heraldic symbols. If we were to start popping double glazing on those, I think the planners, I'd probably end up in Dorset jail. So there is a little bit we can do, I think is the more serious answer. A little bit of insulation, even that in the roof, in the attic space, even that's trickier than it looks because of access. You're often having to cut in, but there are a few places where we can do that. And ironically, we have got a little bit of secondary glazing in the 1920s wing at the back of the house. And where we're doing renovation work, we've been very careful to stick with that as much as we can.
Yes, on roof insulation, the problem is, I think, that a house like that needs a certain amount of drafts to ventilate and provide, to avoid the drops. In my case, I use landscape, which breathes and through which you get air to deal with that problem. Have you actually got down to doing that?
Now, Stephen Pittman, who is our architect from Space, has exactly said to me, you should use lamb's wool. So where we can get to it, we will do that. But if you come over, I'll show you. There's very, very difficult to get access into the active spaces to do that, unfortunately. And of course, in the Great Hall itself, which is like a church room, I hate to say it, there is just no chance at all, because of course, you look up, you've got the marvellous timbers there, but obviously you're then straight out, as you would be with the church roof in the name of the church. I mean, I think possibly one other thing that's worth mentioning is chimneys. And so we're definitely doing some work on chimneys where we suffer from damp coming down chimneys. Now, the ones we use are fine, but we don't use many of them. And that's another whole story about the complexity of using them. But some of those where we're not using them, we are putting in copper lead lining across the chimneys, which is like the opposite of a damp-proof course, and that stops the damp going down, the coldness. So that will help, at least at those quite critical points.
What do you think the CO2 emissions will be in the years after this first build?
Well, it's a fabulous question, and so in case they couldn't get on the internet, what would be the CO2 emissions in the years after it's first built? And one way of thinking about it is they might have been very low for the following reason, that they might well have done most of the heating by wood, by timber, which was a very readily available local fuel. But of course, that would have come from, we think, from sustainably operated forests. So that obviously when they burnt that fuel, they'd have been emitting carbon. But meanwhile, they would have, when they did the cutting down of the trees, they'd be doing it such that they weren't cutting down more than was growing back. Now that's a kind of slick answer, and it's kind of the best that I can do almost. I suspect over time, that quite rapidly wouldn't have worked, as the temptation to cut down the woods and have the sheep out there, which is obviously a big part of the Dorset economy back in the Elizabethan era, might have become a bit too great.
I guess lighting is one of the modern aspects of where we can produce a lot of CO2. Would that produce much CO2?
So let's just think. Very, very good question. So you've got
Giles. Can you hear me? This is Joe Doak online. I'm representing the online participants. Could you briefly summarise the question for the online people?
With pleasure. So the follow-up question here was, what about lighting back in the Elizabethan era? Would that have had quite a lot of carbon emissions? Another great question, and so if we think about that, and somebody else may have also more information on this. So there were two types, as I understand it broadly. You had beeswax, which was the posh lighting, which obviously smelled much nicer and came from the bees. And then you would have had rush lights, which smelled pretty awful. And not quite sure what that was dipped in, but it was literally a rush. I think they dipped it in sort of something like lard from animals. So in both cases, you were burning animal products. And I suspect the answer is a bit like what I said for the wood, for the heating. In other words, you would be doing emissions when you did it, but it was part of a sustainable cycle.
Thank you for your interesting and clear presentation. And whilst you've answered a question about thermal insulation, please can you tell us what you did or might do regarding ventilation and related heat loss issues from drafts?
I think so I guess everybody here could hear that. I think that's another very interesting question. And in a way, I think we kind of touched on it in saying that you kind of need the drafts in order to aerate the house. So we can, I mean, I'm not sure that I have a complete answer to this, but I think kind of the answer is we wouldn't really want to eliminate them completely, because we just really want to keep a bit of decent airflow. And, you know, yet another issue that we haven't touched on here are the various bugs that are always trying to get in. I mean, Owen knows this very, very well in the what we call the Hardy parlour, where Thomas Hardy was sitting on the night that the First World War was declared. And famously in his biography, there's a section about the discussion he had with the host about checking that they've got enough flour in stock. Now, in that room, there are a couple of timbers in the roof that are supposedly, I think, from the Armada, actually. So wonderful old beams, but the trouble with them is that we're not the only people or the only things that think they're wonderful. There are some very, very consistent bugs in there. And I think if we cut out all the drafts, we'd probably make that problem even worse and actually induce it elsewhere. So I think part of the, I mean, there may be a few places where we can look to try and tackle drafts. And I mentioned that we've got some secondary glazing in parts of the 1920s wing at the back. But I fear the answer is we have to kind of live with that. And let me just actually answer that, draw out just another slightly different point about this, which is that one of the joys about the heat pumps is that you don't really use them in the way that you might a gas heating, where you kind of have the thermostat at a level, and it might, depending on what you're kind of doing in how you're using the building, you tend to have it on perhaps maybe in the morning when you're getting up, and then it turns off, and then maybe on again in the evening, maybe not down or off in the middle of the night. Now, with the heat source, you don't do that. You actually typically have it on all the time. And that sounds quite wasteful, but actually it's not, because the whole building just gets up to a lovely even temperature. It's not, the heating is not as intense, it's not as hot as what you get from a gas system. And that in turn, I think, helps to answer the points about insulation and about drafts, because to the extent that you're not pushing the temperature up so much, of course, you don't then lose quite as much heat to the outside world, because the rate of heat loss is proportionate to the gap between your temperature and the outside. So it's much more about that lovely even temperature, and that I think is so much healthier for the house. Maybe you've got to wear that extra sweater or whatever when you're there, but I mean, not to the point that it's kind of worrying, I would say. So anyway, that's again slightly different, perhaps maybe even slightly unexpected answer, but I think very, very important in the way that the heat pumps work.
And it has been added advantage, I think, would be very good for the comfort. Preservation.
I think I don't know if they can hear that online, but the point that that's also very good, say, historic furniture and paintings and so on. Much better actually than that kind of up and down. Yeah, very hot. So the question is, could I say a bit about the planning assumptions that I've made in looking at the battery technology, given the concern that battery technology is evolving very rapidly, and consequently that the batteries, I guess the implication was that in a fairly short period of time, they might, as it were, not really be anywhere near as good as you might have hoped for, or might be able to replace them with. So I think I'm a bit on the bullish end, if you like, about the technology that's being used. I mean, I have to, you saw these were Tesla batteries. I have to confess, I've been driving a Tesla now for five years. I've actually driven over 70,000 miles in the Tesla over that period. And fingers crossed, it doesn't seem to have kind of eroded the battery capacity over that period. Certainly not to the point where I can detect it. And I think the other thing I know from the car is that it's not just about the actual physical technology of the battery, it's also about the software that manages it to ensure that you're not sort of stressing the batteries too much by sort of charging them too rapidly or discharging or charging them too much. So it may be, and you know, we can come back in 5-10 years' time and perhaps repeat the discussion. It may be that I'm wrong, but I think that experience sets up a good beginning over 5 years with very similar technology. Is that in the case of this particular company, there's already a lot of embedded expertise in that product. Now, I'm sure that in a few years' time, there'll be something that is that bit better at that bit lower price. But I think that my feeling is that we've kind of already made a pretty big first leap there, and there will be another leap. There always is, but I think this is probably good. And I think in 10 years' time, my guess would be they won't be looking silly. They may probably with certain say you could do a little bit better than that now, but I don't think you'll be saying, my goodness, that's just complete rubbish. Anyway, we'll see. That's really then, but it's another great question. Thank you,
Giles, we have another question from the online group. For Anthony, can you unmute?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Giles, for your very interesting talk and answering questions. I have a question regarding the complexity of the building and the installation of heat pumps. I'm a representative of the Dorchester Church's Dorchester Baptist Church building in top of town, and we're considering heat pumps for a very different sort of building, but has its complexities. Nothing like as complex as Athelhampton historically, though. My question is, did you have a heat loss calculation survey and energy performance certificate surveyor before the installation? And if so, how did you go about it, and which company did you use for such a complex building? Thank you.
I think hopefully everybody could hear that. So very important question. And the answer is we did indeed have heat loss calculations done. And by the way, I mean, before we had those done, I went and did some back of the envelope ones myself, just on the spreadsheet, because I always like to test it a bit. And it's a lot. You know, people like to make out that this is amazingly complicated. Of course, it's not. I mean, you just make assumptions about what the loss is through internal and external walls, and what the loss is through windows and so on, and all of the kind of, you know, figures, reasonable, sensible figures for that are available online. And I think it's always a jolly good idea to cross-check what the experts, quote unquote, are saying. But anyway, we did have a professional who did all of that. I mean, I personally thought they were a little bit over the top in terms of the heat loss that they said we ought to allow for. And as a result of that, wherever there was, you know, wherever we could, we followed what they said in terms of putting in either slightly bigger radiators or underfloor heating, maybe combining that with a radiator, whatever. But where that just wasn't going to work, where, you know, they were saying, oh, you've got to put a great big new radiator in, sort of completely covering up this historic whatever. I mean, then I just gently said no. You know, we'll just run it a little bit colder than you're, you know, it'll just be a little bit colder than you're saying. And I felt fairly confident, I may again be proved wrong, but I actually felt fairly confident that they were doing a bit of belt and braces there that actually felt it would probably be enough by itself. So that was the interaction there. And you know, I don't want to be rude. I think they've done a fabulous job actually, and we have got a lovely mixture of underfloor heating in some places, some radiators, agonizing to choose some of those, but I'd have to say I think some of the modern version of the old kind of Victorian style radiators are really very beautiful things in their own right, but they are a bit less efficient than the uglier modern kind of white type ones that we have paint those. And then we've got these really cunning trench heaters as well, and in particular in the Great Hall, because obviously perfectly reasonably English heritage will not allow you to lift up the flagstones in a kind of Henry VII era Great Hall or indeed a church and bung some underfloor heating. But fortunately, Mr. Althelhampton, 130 years ago, did actually do just that, was put in some trench heaters, and we repurposed his trench heaters with very, very nice new modern ones. And we copied that idea in a couple of the other historic rooms. So it's like this bit of a shaggy dog story around what we're trying to get at. But so I suppose the bottom line is, yes, we did have heat loss calculations, took them with a very slight pinch of salt, trying to follow them, but if we actually did a little bit less than they were saying, we didn't lose too much sleep. We didn't get an energy efficiency certificate because you don't need that, and I don't think you can have one, and it would look probably too horrendous like Athelhampton. And the name of them, I mean, I think it was done by Wheelers, who are our mechanical and electrical contractor. They did H2 Eco, who are our kind of renewables contractor. Did they do it? There were two, I think you're well, they, exactly. So probably both of those two companies. Yeah. And I think H2 Eco in particular are really, I think, on the nose in kind of being very good on. So for the online people, that really is a two-part question. For other owners in the private sector of grade 1 listed or similar historic buildings, what would my advice be? And then for those in the public, or I guess perhaps National Trust, etc., sector, you know, what would the advice be if different? And I think you were suggesting, Anita, that actually there'd been a bit of story that people haven't been sort of pushing on with it perhaps quite so much. So
yes, my understanding that the ambition is there, but perhaps not necessarily the realisation of that, and the speed at which they're able to achieve it.
Yeah, so Anita's saying that her impression, which I actually would agree with, is that people have been talking a lot about it, some stuff done, but perhaps not quite at the speed that we've done here. So, so what I would say is that clearly I am aware of a handful of cases where people pretty much in the private sector have gone down this road, and I think one or two, I think probably rather smaller houses have done something very similar. And then I know in the historic houses, for example, they had an example last year, the association that is, of somewhere where they got a very interesting project with wood chips, which were locally sourced. And I thought it was a great project, but I have to say I don't think they were able to achieve a zero carbon with that. And I did think it was very faintly naughty that they had a kind of diesel-operated kind of excavator that was hauling them around. Didn't seem quite, but anyway. But overall, that was a nice sort of good step in the right direction. So, what, as it were, I think the advice really is it's a bit like jumping in the deep end. To be honest, shut your eyes, hold your nose, and jump. And I mean, maybe energy costs are, after the current sort of episode, are going to fall back steeply, but probably not. And maybe the carbon worries that we have about are over it, but probably not. Probably, if anything, it's even worse than people say. So I think you have to push on with it. The economics of it will vary from one place to another, and the more that you have to do ancillary works, so for example, if you have got to put the pumps in quite a long way away, then you've got to build heavily insulated underground trench to kind of to bring the heat in. That will obviously put the cost up. But I think it is a matter of just shut your eyes and jump in, and the payback maybe that bit longer, that bit shorter, but just really have to do it. And I think that applies in the public sector, and there the financial constraints may be greater, but then I think it's a matter of perhaps lobbying government and saying, look, you want us to go zero carbon. And by the way, it's even apart from the narrow economics of it, I think if a prominent public building is doing it, it's a fabulous example to people. So the question was, where have we put the heat pumps? So the picture that I showed, that is the pump for that there, that one, there we are, we can show it online as well. Very, very neat. So that was relatively very easy. For the main house, much more difficult. Sorry, let me just explain one other thing. Because this is ground source, the only thing that is external are the pipes underground, which go underneath the paddock. So essentially, with the big advantage of ground source with a historic building is all you've got to do is find a kind of storeroom like this somewhere that doesn't have great historic value, and then you can just put these kind of indoor units, and then essentially those connect underground into the pipes that go underground under your field next door, or that go into a borehole. So that actually is relatively easy in a historic building. If you're using air source, which we are using in the main building, and which we have to because we kind of run out of space to put the ground source just below the surface. And we could have done boreholes, but both of them were expensive and they're more risky. You don't know you're going to get people sort of say, yeah, I should be all right, but you know, I'm talking about jumping into the deep end, but I'm not completely crazy. So there what we had to do is just exercise ingenuity, and most of them are on the wall of an outbuilding, which the planners were happy with, and I was happy with, because they can't really be seen from anywhere apart from if you peer through some obscure corner of the garden through lots of bushes, and you'll barely be aware that they're there anyway, because they're kind of all black and everything. But the cost of that was that you then had to have, not very long, but a little bit of this heavy-duty underground pipework to bring the water into the house. And then the other lot for the main house, just because of the layout of it's quite complicated, that we've actually had to put on the wall of the cafe in a kind of very discreet place in a kind of service yard. And that involves quite a long run of underground insulated pipe, which is definitely quite pricey, but was the only way we could get that wall into the Great Hall.
Yeah, not easy to do.
Not easy, but actually I think if you just think around it, you will find a way. And I mean, in fact, we could have done a borehole for the Great Hall, and then we wouldn't have had to have such a long pipe. We could have perhaps put them on the pipework under the west lawn, and then maybe it wouldn't have quite had the capacity, but it would have given us enough to kind of keep it. So I think you've just got to say, in a great hall like a church, how warm do you really need to be? And you don't it's not like, you know, a living room. Just accept that it won't be quite as warm, but it'll keep that chill away throughout the whole year.
Giles, we have another question. Would Anthony unmute?
Thank you. I may have missed something early on, Giles, but I don't know whether you told us about how hot water is heated. Perhaps you did, and I may have missed it, so I apologise. But do you use at all any what are called solar eye boosts or equivalent equipment which divert excess electricity generated during the day into insulated hot water tanks before they are sent and stored in the lithium batteries? I wonder whether you have that sort of apparatus and system, or perhaps you just don't need it.
I mean, a lovely question, and the answer is that's one particular bit of technology that in this we've not used. So we just simply, we use the heat pumps to heat up the water, but we're not attempting that kind of time shifting that you've mentioned there, which obviously is another very interesting technology and will definitely be suitable for some sites, but we've just not gone down that route. And I think the batteries are kind of giving us the time shift that we need.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So the question is, we've got a lot of technology installed. Do we have, or are we planning to have tours Owen, do you want to take that one? Yeah. Can we grab a mic? I'm just asking Owen Davis, who manages the house, just to comment on another great question.
Hi. Yes, we will do some tours. I think our installation is quite large, but it's very scalable, so you can imagine what it's like to scale down. So we will do some tours. We've certainly got some big houses coming to see us who want to have a look at what we've done, and not only look at what we've done, but also to understand the finances of it. But it's something that I've got householders. I've even done some of it myself now, because it just makes such a good choice. So yes, certainly tours whenever anybody wants to.
Giles, we've got another question from Philip online. Yes.
Hello again. Please, what have you to say regarding yesterday's IPCC's latest report? It's the latest of 3 recent reports, and this one is about action. And it says that we have to peak our fossil fuel use by 2025. That's a very short time away, as everybody will realise. And thus, we have very little time left to get all our energy use via such means as you've shown. I'm asking you what you think about that. Obviously, they're not saying we've got to do it all by 2025, but they are saying we've very little time left to peak out of fossil fuel use and onto other means such as you've shown.
Thank you for that. I think in a way the answer is a little bit like the answer I gave to Anita, which is you just kind of got to jump in and get on with it. But let me just add, so, to really encourage everybody to get on with it, but let me just actually add one thing to that, and in a way it also relates back to the question about the battery technology, which is that I think it is worth just looking very closely and saying, has the technology reached, not total maturity, technology goes on and on and on improving. Cars may have apparently kind of overtaken bicycles, but actually bicycle technology has gone on developing and improving for the last 100 years. Fabulous. So it will go on improving, but the question is, has it kind of got past that sort of early teething difficult stage to something that has really got pretty robust and may not be perfect, will improve, but is actually really pretty good. And I think if you can feel comfortable with that, then you can go with it and make that leap and help to meet that kind of peaking in 2025. And just to now just be very specific, I've already answered the question about the batteries and feeling that it has got to that kind of point. I think with ground source, it's been there for quite a while. Interestingly, I think the mist and solar are also really quite a while. Again, there are clearly new generations coming in and so on, but I think what you've got now is really pretty good. But I think the one thing that has been the weak link in the chain has been air source. And I mean, to be brutal about it, most air source heat pumps were just air conditioners. This is literally what they were. They were air conditioners turned around. And the manufacturers just said, well, we're making an air conditioner. We're just sort of switch it around. So it's heating rather than cooling. And we can, make a quick buck because it's just, we don't have to redo all our tooling and so on. Well, that was okay. But the result was that they really weren't very good. And in fact, the reason I felt confident to put in a whole bank of air source pumps at Athelhampton was that people who I trust really said this very latest generation, this is actually Daikin, really is a leap forward designed from bottom up to not as an air conditioner, but actually as a proper air source heat pump. Now again, I hope my trust will be well placed, but so I think that is very important to this. The technology has reached tipping points where we can feel comfortable, but be careful if you buy, and I think when you are holding your nose and jumping in, I think do the research to make sure that you're not actually buying the model of 2 or 3 years ago or from someone who is not at the forefront, because that actually may not be the case that will really do the job. So the question was, do I think that I can turn Athelhampton into a loss-making business? And if so, how and how long it will take? Well, I think the business plan, which I've obviously also worked on with Owen, is very much about looking, I mean, it's really about focusing on visitors, daily visitors, not to the exclusion of events such as weddings, which we, of the right kind, we absolutely welcome and think we can offer a lovely service, not to the exclusion of wonderful events like the Royal Ballet or like the Dorset Food and Drink Fair, but very much with the focus on the visitors, simply because the economics of it are incredibly good. Every time you get an extra visitor, you're not having to add much of any resource. I mean, when the flow becomes great enough, you might need 2 stewards in the house rather than 1. You might need an extra person serving in the cafe. So there obviously the costs do go up a bit, but not crazy. Whereas if you're putting on a wedding or a big event, you really need enormous resources. And then how do you get temporary staff and so on? It's really quite a nightmare. And I think, working with Owen, we sort of said we will do those events where it works, but we'll focus on those daily visitors. And then, of course, what you've got to do is to encourage that and market that. And so you just have to look at every route you can. And it's of course the dreaded social media. It's very much looking where you get lucky, hopefully, with something in the media. We had a wonderful article in Country Life last year with fabulous, if you dig it out, it really looks at the history by a very, very good gentleman who's done that. We literally just finished filming about 200 yards away from here at Martin White's, I think it is, antique shop in Dorchester High Street, filming a programme about Athelhampton, which, do everybody please look, Channel 5, 1 week from today at 7 o'clock in the evening, or get it on catch up. And obviously most of it was filmed at Athelhampton, but that particular last little bit was filmed in Dorchester. And so all that media coverage helps, and you can't make that come out of thin air. You've just got to kind of seize the opportunity when somebody suggests it and just encourage them and be very welcoming to them. And then with any luck, they'll do it, as it were. We were hoping to get the BBC Antiques Roadshow, but after a lot of discussions and the team came down and we thought we were there, and then they said, oh, we might do it next year. Right. So, but never mind, and actually anyway, perhaps that's good. We have the Channel 5 this one, and maybe we do get the Antiques Roadshow next year. So that's part of what you do. And then dare I say it, I mentioned, I think in the intro we said, I have written the book Anne of Athelhampton and the Riddle of the Apes, which is not really just for kids. In fact, I think most of the people who read it are probably, perhaps maybe people in this room, I don't know. Anyway, so it's very much a book for adults as well, and I'm busily finishing off volume 2 of that. So commercial break here, but seriously, I mean, I think that a book like that is just a wonderful way of getting the word out a bit, and people look at that and that spreads the word. So it's just looking for every possible route really, and meanwhile keeping a very close eye on the cost side. And the staff numbers have come down almost entirely. I'm very proud to say organically, which has been good. And I think we were discussing beforehand. I mean, just things like we used to have one desk that welcomed you into the cafe and a separate desk where you purchased your ticket and buy items from the shop. We've just amalgamated those, and you save a staff member, but you actually have a better service, just much more natural for people as they come in. So I think it's all sorts of things like that that we look for. So the question is, I think I might break even. I very much hope I'll actually make a few bob. So we'll see. So thank you very much for that. And just for the online people, the gentleman was saying that having moved to Dorchester a couple of years ago, come to Athelhampton quite a lot, and thank you for that, that's tremendous, and saying that enjoying very much the material, the posters we have got up there about this Athelhampton Zero project, but would have wished to have seen a bit more and a bit more detail. Well, thank you very much for that, and that's actually great feedback, and I think that encourages us to put more up. And maybe we should have a page in the guidebook. That's maybe that's what we can. I think, to be honest, when we began, we wanted to publicise it. At the same time, we're just a little bit hesitant. We didn't want to put people off, but I think the response from yourself and from many other people has been so positive. I think that really does encourage us. And in fact, one of the things among the various things we can do, as well as some posters and perhaps something in the guidebook, whatever, I think we're hoping to have a display in real time showing how much solar energy. So as you have a cup of tea, you can see the solar power coming in, which will have helped to heat up your cup of tea. Well, thank you so much for that. And again, just for the online people, maybe very, very kindly saying, you know, how good this is, what's going on there. And thank you so much for that, and saying it should be publicised that much more. So I think we will absolutely take that, as well as the previous question, and really sort of push it out that much more. And I'm sure we could, that would be a great idea, and we could put that picture on the back page of the guidebook, and which would be a really good prominent place for it there, and then perhaps put some more time. This could go on the website actually, this presentation back again. So great. I mean, thank you. Yeah, really take that as an encouragement to do that. So the gentleman is asking, he was saying congratulations, and then saying that we've got some wonderful greenhouses at Athelhampton, and asking if there is a possibility to produce food there. And I mean, the answer actually is we do, and we will do more, although there are issues because the wrong kind of food can actually be incredibly expensive to produce on what, although those look very big, those greenhouses, but the scale is, commercially, of course, is relatively very small. I mean, Owen, do you want to just add anything about that issue about growing stuff in greenhouses? The ongoing topic of big conversation at Athelhampton that you put your finger on here, so thank you. Well, thank you for that. And for those online, the lady very kindly was thanking me for buying Athelhampton, was having been there quite some time ago, and then back a couple of weeks ago was saying how wonderful the staff were, and what a lovely time you had. Well, thank you so much for that comment. And actually, that's what makes it really worthwhile to get that kind of feedback. So thank you so much, and we'll obviously pass that on as well to everybody. Thank you. So the question, thank you for that, was did we have to do a lot of work with English Heritage to get permission to all of this? And I mean, of course, the answer is absolutely yes, big time. Although to be slightly more exact, it was my sort of wonderful architect, Stephen Pittman, who runs Space, which, by the way, he trained at, I think, the architecture practice here in Dorchester that Thomas Hardy trained at. The one which is it? Okay, yes, so there you are. And so everything has to be agreed with them, and pretty much down to kind of, you know, where you're going to dig a hole in the lawn. I mean, I like to say you literally, in theory at least, can't even kind of put a picture on the wall without getting permission. But no, he has, and I think the way he's worked, which is great, is to really bring them on board in terms of what we're trying to do. And I think actually, I would say that overall they've obviously been very careful about what we're doing and checked it, and we had to do some historical surveys. I think in order to put in some of the pipes, we had to have a gentleman who did a historical survey about the garden, looking at archaeological issues. So there was a lot of that kind of checking, but I think when they saw we were doing all of that properly, they actually were very accommodating. And actually, if I'm allowed to just mention one other thing, perhaps picking up on this, in parallel with doing and kind of complementary to this work, we got a kind of particularly exciting project to take the old Tudor kitchen and take that back as far as we can to its Tudor origins. So there was a marvellous great brick arch which kind of extended from where I am to where Anita is over there. And that had kind of modern units in front of it. It was covered in thick white paint and kind of almost completely bricked in to support the building above. And so all of that has been taken back to the way it would have been when it was built in about 1560. The paint's been stripped off, the modern units have been taken away, we've got beautiful new flagstones, we've discovered the old hearth stones, and we've taken away the supporting bricks, so we had to put in a kind of hidden steel sort of wire behind to support it. And of course, all of that, English heritage had to kind of just be on board for every bit of that, and not just at the beginning, but they come in periodically to check as you go through that. I mean, I think that's been really worthwhile. That, by the way, has underfloor heating, which will be powered by the heat pumps under those flagstones, and that will become another new part of the whole visitor tour. So that will be a room that was previously you couldn't, as a visitor, go into, and which you wouldn't necessarily have wanted to go into very much. But I hope that now people will really want to go into that. So yeah, that's another element of it all. So the questions, did James Weir, who's coming to talk here, do you know Owen, if he came? Yeah. Right, I wasn't there when, so yes, he did, is the answer to that question, yeah. So, if I understand the question, what was the main reason for choosing Athelhampton? I mean, I think all you can say is it's just the most wonderful, special house. And it's not just that it's, I think, architecturally wonderful and that it's unlike many, many houses from the Tudor era, it hasn't been sort of altered in a bad way. So much of it is still original. But I think the other thing is that it really has the feel of a family house. And we know that the people who built it, the Martin family, were there as a family for generation after generation. And then many other people brought up their children there. And I mean, my children now are a little bit too old to be at the kind of being brought up stage. But nevertheless, they like to come and have a glass of wine in front of the roaring fire in the great hall, and no doubt now in the kind of refurbished Tudor kitchen. And we have actually got a great big family event that's coming up in August. So I think you can just feel that when you go in there. And in fact, I don't know if we need to draw to a close, but perhaps I can perhaps one way of summarising to say people do talk a lot about ghosts at Athelhampton. And there are lots of stories of them. And one of our colleagues who spends a lot of time there has had one or two quite extraordinary experiences. He was in that Tudor kitchen and I don't know, the door blew open and then he had both a phone and a sort of iPad or something, and they both cut out, even though the electricity was still running. They weren't plugged in, they were both cut out. You know, the batteries weren't low or anything. And he had to run upstairs and he was in the middle of a phone call with someone. Absolutely extraordinary. And he said quite clearly he felt there was something there. But do you know what? He said they were playing. They weren't being nasty, they were just playing. And I think that's the thing about the ghosts of Athelhampton. It's false. They just they want to be part of the family.
So, next thing is ghost. Are there any more questions online?
I could ask one.
Nothing from Joe.
Hello, I have a question, or perhaps not so much a question, but more in the way asking about feedback. What about Athelhampton's historic or embodied carbon footprint?
I mean, I think embodied carbon is what it is. And I think in the presentation, obviously, I very carefully said we're talking about ongoing energy carbon output. And yes, this is one of the major issues in any approach to carbon. And of course, there's a carbon content to what one puts in on a project like this. All you can do is to try and do things as efficiently as you can, choose technology that's going to last for as long as possible, and looking back at the, I don't know, the carbon that was embedded in, you know, the emissions, dare I say it, of the horses that pulled the stones up to Athelhampton. I'm afraid, you know, that's long past, and that would have contributed perhaps to warming in the past, but it is just embedded in there, and we can't go back over that. All we can do is just try to minimise what we do going forward.
Well, thank you very much, Giles. I can't actually remember a talk which has generated so many interesting questions, and I think the interesting part of the meeting has been the questions and the answers, and I think they're all much, much wiser for having listened to it. So I'd be very grateful if you would mark your appreciation by a round of applause.